Good.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me just ask this, it's kind of a warm-up. Has anybody heard of the Book of Nature? Let's have a show of hands. How many people have heard of the Book of Nature before? Only our people who are sort of like seminary or beyond trained. Okay, so that's good. So then I think this is going to be really interesting for everybody and very informative. Okay, so a little introduction. The Book of Nature is basically a way that Christians view the natural world for really most of Christian history, I would say, at least in the West.
It is an actual book?
No, it's not an actual book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not a book. It's not a book. We'll get to that.
I'm sorry.
Good morning. No, that's a good question. It's not a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, listen. Tom makes a good point. Everybody's probably going to have to sort of take off some of your preconceived notions for this class. And I'm going to take you back in time a little bit to show you how our, ancestors in the faith thought about some things that, we think about quite differently today. But the extra challenge is, and this is what's up on the slide right here, is I think most of us in America probably have this, I would say, incorrect historical narrative in our minds about the topics that we're going to be talking about in this class. And the reason we have those ideas is they're coming from a lot of different directions. But I think this is kind of a popular narrative in Christian circles and just in the public in America today, that Christians thought about nature in ways similar to how young earth creationists think about nature today for most of Christian history. For, just kind of like all of Christian history until the Enlightenment in Europe. The Enlightenment, 18th century. And then at that point, some people kept those traditional views and other people chose to, believe in science over those traditional Christian views. Does that sound familiar to people, that sort of an idea? Okay.
Can you explain how the young earth creationists thought about nature? Did I miss that part?
No.
Okay.
We're going to get there. This class is going to present a very different story than that. Okay? 'Cause this, in my opinion, is incorrect for a lot of different reasons, which we'll unpack. Here's a kind of outline of the course for 4 weeks. So today is part 1, reading the Bible and the Book of Nature allegorically from Augustine to the dawn of the Reformation. Is everybody's probably familiar with the Reformation? Martin Luther, 1517. And a lot of people heard of Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in Western Christianity. And let me just say this too. Virginia, my wife Virginia, is going to be teaching 3 courses this fall on global church history. And so you should, be here for that. It's going to be great. This, you can probably already tell, is, in some of our imaginations, maybe global church history too, but it's not actually global church history. This is just Western Christianity. Do you know what I mean? Like there's already a split between, the Orthodox and Western, like Latin Christianity by the time of Augustine, right? And we're going to, I study German history, so we're going to be kind of making a through line from, Martin Luther. He was an Augustinian monk. Some of you probably knew that. But then we're going to get through, the Enlightenment and things like that, all Western European perspective, right up into a very kind of American-centric idea, because this debate between creationism and things is also a very American thing. So, just I'll just kind of say that now, but keep in mind that this is not the full picture of Christian thought that we're talking about in this class, okay? Okay, part 2, this will be next week. A literal Bible in a changing world, the Reformation and the scientific revolution. So this is already a big switch. You see here allegorically to literal. So we're going to unpack that. And then you see the scientific revolution. So, it's all going to make sense, but we kind of have to build piece by piece. The Enlightenment Bible, what happens in the Enlightenment. And then part 4, abandoning the book of nature, biblicism and Darwinism in the age of science. And I'm really going to be making the case that what creationists believe today is a very, very young idea. It actually doesn't even formulate in the way that it is today until after the Enlightenment. So we don't see that specific idea happen until recently. In week 4, we're going to look and see even 100 years ago at the kind of foundation of fundamentalist Christianity, they weren't even creationists yet at that point. So it's almost like a 20th century development. But we're going to get there. We're going to talk about why we have this. Just go back here for a second. Why this narrative has become so popular in the church and outside the church. And then I'm going to be presenting a sort of alternative narrative. That's what we're going to be doing week by week. It's going to build step by step. And we're going to go to some foreign places. Yes?
Who wrote the Book of Nature?
Oh yeah, we'll get to what the Book of Nature is in just a second. I love that everybody's so intrigued already, so that's good. That's good. But before we get there, let me just say a little thing about my, approach, right? I'm a historian, and so this is what I tell all my students when I'm teaching. This is how historians think. This is thinking like a historian. Here's my claim. Here's my evidence. Judge for yourself. This is not a sort of normative, moral, hey, if you're a good person, you would believe this on this topic. That's not how discourse works within the historical profession. And I think that the way that historians do this is actually something that's helpful outside of history too. Like if in more of American public discourse we use this type of approach, I think we could probably have some more fruitful conversations than we have a lot of the time. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this is what it is for historians. You make a claim, and we're kind of humble now, historians are, about whether the claim is true or not, because we understand that history is very complex. You know what I mean? You can tell a lot of different stories, a lot of different true stories about the same topic even. So that's why I kind of summarize this. Historians tell factually accurate stories about the past. And that's what I think my presentation is. Factually accurate, plausible, but it's just based off of the evidence that we have. Does that make sense? I'm going to share it with you. You see if you find it to be compelling or not. And that's the other thing is you judge for yourself. So that's how historians do. We try to convince each other based off of the evidence that we have. And let me just also say at the outset, though, because we're in a church right now, right? Not a history class at a university or something like that. And we are talking about issues that are very close for certain people to their theological beliefs, maybe their theological identity, things like that, right? So let me just say, too, this is what I would say. Faith is more important than what you believe on these topics. That's my personal belief. I love that in the Evangelical Covenant Church, here at Faith, what you believe about creation or nature, things like that is, we're not telling each other you're a bad Christian if you have a different view on creation. I grew up in a church that's different than that. If you weren't a young earth creationist, you're probably not a good Christian either in the church that I grew up in. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's problematic because I say, because then when people hear things like that I'm going to present to you, and if you're convinced by it, then you're in a real sort of you can be in a real theological crisis, you know what I mean, for your or faith crisis even. So I always tell people, don't throw the Christ child out with the bathwater. You know what I mean? Like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there's something you have to change in your views, that's okay. Don't throw the whole thing away. You know what I mean? Because I don't want anyone to sort of have be in a real sticky spot personally because of the stuff that we're going to be covering in this class. Maybe you're just going to have to say, like, you know what? I'm sticking to my views, and this is interesting or not interesting to you, but I'm just sticking with my views anyway, and that's totally fine as well. You know what I mean? So I just kind of want to make that caveat at the very beginning also. Okay, so let's dive into it a little bit. Yes?
Judge for yourself, but don't judge me.
Well, that's, no, exactly, but I think that's kind of implicit in it because you're handing it over, I'm handing it over to you. Do you see what I'm saying? My part of it is finding the evidence and telling the story, and then I hand it off. It's out of my control at that point. Does that make sense? When I publish my article and it's out there, the other people are going to read it and they're going to say it's good work or bad work. You see what I mean? So that's exactly right. It's not my place to tell you what to think. So there's not that. It's not structurally set up where you have this kind of like, hey, you should think this or you should think that. And my students write this in papers a lot, and I tell them, like, when I see you should, I say, hold on, that's not really how historians talk. Do you see what I'm saying? We don't tell each other, you should believe this, you should believe that. We just sort of say, here's something that I think is factually true, and you decide. So, thanks, Sally, that's a really good point. Okay, so reading the Bible and the Book of Nature allegorically from Augustine to the dawn of the Reformation. And this is a fun woodcut from 1490. You have an astronomer and a theologian having a debate about these exact type of topics that we're talking about, the relationship between the Bible and the natural world. And you can see, they have a book, maybe the Bible. They're also making these, natural observations from the heavens about how the world works. So as we'll see throughout Christian history, people have been thinking about the relationship between the Bible and the natural world. All right, let me just say really quickly, since people are asking about the Book of Nature. We'll get to it in a sec, but not to leave you in suspense for too long. The idea of the Book of Nature is that God communicates to us not only through revelation, and our sort of like in the age of the church, our revelation is recorded in the Bible. You know what I mean? That's obviously like kind of our main source of revelation, but that's sort of what we think that the Bible is. Kind of revealed communication from God to humanity, right?
In words.
In words, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so in a book. Okay? So that's the book of Revelation, or the Bible, right? And then it's sort of an analogy to say, you know what? God also reveals himself to us in another way through creation. And of course, this is also a biblical idea that God reveals himself to us through creation. And if we look around, we can read nature like a book. So it's like a book, you know what I mean? And that's the book of nature. So these are the two books. God's sort of spoken revelation, written revelation, and then the revelation from God that we can see in nature. That how he reveals himself there, communicates to us in that way. So, okay, so is everyone clear on the book of nature now? Yeah, at that level, sort of foundational level? Okay. So having established that, we'll get to the allegorical part in a second, but we need to do a little more groundwork. And again, you'll see this is one of the reasons why I say like the ideas in creationism don't go earlier than the Enlightenment. They certainly don't go earlier than the scientific revolution for the reasons that I'm about to show you right now, because we have to understand when Christians are looking and seeing what God wrote to us in the book of nature, we need to understand how they viewed the physical world around them, or the natural world around them. Is everyone following with me here still? Okay, and so this is where we need to talk about Aristotelian cosmology. So Aristotle lived in the 4th century BC. Maybe you know Aristotle. Does anybody want to say anything you know about Aristotle?
Do you want a clicker or two for your slide?
No, it's okay.
My understanding was that he thought that we could learn things by observing the parts and then understanding the whole based on observations of the parts. Is that true?
Oh, that's good. Do we have markers? Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, yeah, and we're gonna talk more. More about Aristotle's way of studying nature, because it is also different in some key ways. Has some things in common. It's empirical, I guess you could say, but it also has some key differences from scientific methods of inquiry. What else do we know about Aristotle? He
Believe in Jesus.
well, no, it's a good point.
Wasn't a Jew.
He wasn't Jewish. He's Greek pagan. 300s BC, so obviously not a Christian in that sense. He had a very famous pupil. Does anybody know who that was? No. Yes, Alexander the Great. Thanks. Yeah, he was Alexander the Great's tutor. I think, and tell me if you know, 300 BC, that Alexander the Great and Aristotle are the most influential duo in human history. I'm talking a duo, not just Jesus and Muhammad or something. Do you know what I mean? They didn't even live at the same time. I'm talking about they had a relationship with each other. Because, Alexander the Great conquered Persia. He sort of laid the groundwork for what I call the Mediterranean world. Basically the cultural context of Western Christianity, right? So he's very influential. What language is the New Testament written in, for instance? Greek, because it's still the common language of the day, right? Because of Alexander's conquest. And Aristotle, he didn't make this all up, right? He studied people at his disposal, but he sort of formulated our view of the universe in a way that lasted for 2,000 years. Until the scientific revolution, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and everything. 2,000 years. Today, I think probably our Christian beliefs are about the only beliefs we have that are 2,000 years old. Do you know what I'm saying? So this is a very long time that this is how people thought about nature. And I'm just going to sketch it out for you really quickly. Starting from the ground up, the Earth is at the center of the universe in Aristotelian cosmology. Keep an eye. Wait, let me see.
And it's not flat?
No, the Earth is not flat, and that's another one that is commonly people used to think the Earth was flat. I think there's more flat earthers today than ever before in history. Well, numerically, for sure, because the human population of the world is so much bigger. And do you know when the population of the world really exploded? 1950. Since 1950. Yeah, the population of the world was about 2 billion in 1950. So that's another thing that happened much more recently than you probably realize. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of an aside. I won't go down that rabbit trail. I would almost think, at least in the Western world, probably, and I have no data. This is just pure speculation. Even percentage-wise, I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's probably more flat earthers today, percentage-wise, than there was during these 2,000 years. Because Aristotle is actually really big on circles. Really big on circles. And it's actually obvious from a lot of different directions that the Earth is not flat. Is the moon flat? Is the sun flat? Nothing's flat in the universe. Nothing's, no celestial bodies are flat. Anyway, but that's another one that sort of shows, people get these ideas about history, and they just came from somewhere and they stuck because they were a popular idea, but they're not accurate. Okay, does anybody know the 4 elements? We're starting from the center of the universe here. Fire, yes.
Water, wind,
Yes, fire, air,
earth.
earth, yeah,
Water?
and water. Hey, good job. Okay, exactly. And I put them in a certain order here: earth, water, air, fire. Aristotle's really big on concentric circles. Because, and I've done this before, so it might be a little familiar for some people. If I took my cup, here it is, and I poured this water out, where would it go? It would go down, and if I dropped a rock in a pond across the street, the rock would go down through the pond to the bottom, right? But if I lit a candle in here, which way would the flame go? Exactly. So this is how physics work for these four elements. Things have their natural resting place, and they try to get to their natural resting place. So that is a property of water itself. This is what I'm telling you, like, put your views outside of your mind for a second and fill them up with how people thought about the world for 2,000 years. Okay, this is not, like, in a way, crazy idea, in a way, not so crazy when you think that this was so compelling. People believe this for 2,000 years. It's actually very intuitive, you know what I mean? But it's not gravity acting on the water, it's water itself. It's trying to go to its natural resting place. Does that make sense? So it's a different way of thinking about nature, about physics. But of course, I can throw a rock into the air, right? So the four elements are mixing together. They're also like mixing together in everything else that you see. Like everything is comprised of the four elements. Okay, does that make sense to everybody there? But this is only in part of the universe, because once you get to the moon, this is the moon here, then things are different. First of all, the moon is made out of the fifth element. You've heard of the fifth element? Does anybody know what it is?
Ether.
Ether, exactly. So starting with the moon and beyond, remember, the Earth is at the center of the universe. So that's what I'm saying, to be more precisely, water and rocks aren't going down and up. It feels like down and up from our perspective, but it's towards the center of the universe or away from the center of the universe. Does that make sense? So fire is going away from the center of the universe. Okay, but once you get to the moon, everything is made out of the fifth element, ether. And there's different physics, because if things here move up or down, down here below the moon, or towards the center or away from the center, which direction are things moving in the heavens? Yeah, around. Does that make sense? Yeah, like we know the moon's going around the Earth, right? Okay, so this is one thing that, when we get to the scientific revolution, is a pretty big thing you probably don't know about. But this sort of like line here between the sublunary realm, below the moon, and beyond the moon, is very, very important in Aristotelian cosmology. That obviously is not the way the universe works. Do you know what I mean? There's not a different. This is why, like, it's not just like the astronomical observations or whatever that people were making that caused this way of looking at the universe to collapse. But it's also like, you maybe heard of Galileo dropping like cannonballs from like a tower and stuff, and they were shooting cannonballs. They were studying physics and really trying to see, hold on, does a cannonball that I shoot, from here to that mountain follow the same laws, right? They came to be formulated as laws, the same laws of physics as the Earth and the moon and things like that. And of course they concluded that it does. But that's what's so revolutionary about it, is that in Aristotelian cosmology, there's a different set of physics once you get to the moon and beyond. But there's a lot of other implications. So if everything, from the supralunary realm and beyond is made out of ether, then what's the sun made out of? What?
Ether also.
Also ether, not fire. Okay? Because fire is one of the 4 sublunary elements. It's not out in space. Everything's moving in perfect circles out there, and everything is a perfect sphere. So the moon is a perfect sphere, but what about the man on the moon? Yeah, what is this? Well, you can't be craters on a perfect sphere, right? So what are those? How do you explain that? It said those are clouds in the sublunary realm obstructing our view of the moon. Does that make sense? The sun is also ether, not a giant ball of fire. So why is the sun like you walk outside and feel warmth? What's that about? It's the movement of the sun. It's the motion of the sun causes the effects that you see from the sun on the sublunary elements. The moon obviously has an influence too, and tides and things like that. So you can see that it makes sense that like the other planets and then the stars also have an influence on things. So this is why astrology and astronomy are like one and the same in this time period, and why astrology just makes natural sense in this universe. Are you following with me here? Because it'd be almost crazy, I think, to say the moon has effect, the sun has an effect, but Mars doesn't, and the stars don't. They're all made out of the same thing, and you can't deny that the sun and the moon are having an effect. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so this is all part of the universe that we're working with here, and then another important thing is like things are volatile here on Earth. Like in my research, I studied ideas about the weather in the 16th century. So there's a lot of ideas about how the planets influence the weather. Mars is like hot and dry, things like that. Does that make sense? But the last thing I was going to say is like the heavens are moving perfectly, and they're always moving the same way. So this is another way where it's sort of like a direct connection between how God created it and the impact that the physical world is having on our like lived experience today. So when you think of looking in nature as a book of nature to learn about God, this is the naturalistic framework that people are working within. And I think hopefully you have a little bit of an idea that it's quite a bit different than the way we conceive of nature today. So just to do some basics there. Okay, so let's keep moving.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
So in terms of the influence of Aristotelian cosmology,
Yes.
given that a lot of Aristotle's writings kind of faded from direct influence with more influence from like Middle Platonism, later Neoplatonism, would this cosmology have just kind of been assumed kind of across those different schools?
Yes, I think so. This is really basic.
Yeah.
This is really basic. So there's a lot of continuity. Here's a picture. I think all those different schools that you have in mind, like nobody has an alternative to this.
Okay.
Does that make
in terms
sense?
of like,
That's what I'm saying, like nobody was a flat earther that I know of, because I also think that this permeated society. Like I said, I'm an expert on 16th century Germany, and I can tell you there that this permeated society because I've looked at the sources. But I also think that that this is like common knowledge for learned and unlearned people.
and like Christians that would have been engaging this pre-Reformation, say,
Yeah.
from what I've seen, it seems like the main point of discontinuity is, like Aquinas would say, basically, we accept Aristotle apart from the eternity of the world. Like, the world had...
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
the world had
We're
a
actually going to
beginning,
get to that. We're actually going to get to
but kind of
that.
accept that framework.
Yeah, we're actually going to get to that. And I'm starting from Augustine, you know what I mean? Because there are other... I'm not as much of an expert on, like, Middleton. You know Middleton? What is his name? Anyway,
Milton?
what?
J. Richard Milton?
Yes, I met him, like, at a conference. Yeah, both of them scholar. I met him at a conference at North Park, our denomination seminary, last year. He's an expert on like Jewish cosmology. And that's different than Aristotelian cosmology. So, but Paul, of course, was very learned. So, and I'm not an expert on this exactly, but I could tell you that by Augustine in Western Europe, we're in this universe here. Does that make sense? Does that kind of answer your question too? Okay, so yeah, so here's, sort of like a modern picture that's sort of showing it. Here's a picture from like the period that I study, like late 1400s, 1500s type idea. It's basically a nicer version of what I drew on the board for you. Okay, so yeah, and to get back to this, how do we study nature? This is also different. So Aristotle says we need to observe what nature does on its own to understand nature. So this is a different starting premise than we have in scientific observation. He says, let's start with what everybody knows and work from there. The question that we're going to ask really is why. So we look at a tree, we all know what a tree is. We want to know, like, why does a tree go from like an acorn to a big tree and then decay? So this is the big theme, generation and corruption, like how things generate, grow up, and then decay, this sort of cycle. As you can sort of already maybe pick up from the elements, there's this 4 things. This is maybe like Galen, if you know about like pre-modern medicine and the different humors. I sort of mentioned it with Mars already. It's like hot and dry. Things are kind of hot, cold, dry, or wet. You know what I mean? And there's a balance of these 4 things. And then this was just mentioned too. Aristotle says the universe is eternal. So it goes through cycles, but the physical universe is also eternal. That doesn't mean it's totally static. And I brought up a book to show you guys. It's a fascinating book. On the Edge of Eternity, The Antiquity of the Earth in Medieval and Early Modern Europe by Ivano Del Prete, and I met him at a conference in Chicago last year too. He really knows his stuff, so he's looking mostly at kind of Italian sources in this book, but you can take a look at that if you're interested. Okay, so this is a big difference when you say we're going to start with what everybody knows and then go from there. Again, this is why I also say this is like very intuitive, but this is also very different than how we do in science, because he says this is why it's not like experimental like we have in modern science, because he says you can't go like slice and dice a tree to learn about it, because you're not going to see what it does in nature. Does that make sense? So you have to watch it doing its thing in nature to learn about it. So that's also how people studied and understood nature in this time period. We'll move on from the 4 causes. I think we're getting enough of a picture here. We got to make sure we get here. Okay. Okay. So the Bible and Aristotle. So this is where let's bring in Augustine here. So Augustine actually argued that the universe was created instantaneously, and that the 6 days are like a narrative or explanatory. Like I said, he read the Bible allegorically. So, do we kind of have an idea of what allegory is? Does anybody? Do we know Pilgrim's Progress? That's probably like maybe the most famous. I mean, I think it's one of them. I think it might be like the 2nd most printed book in English behind the Bible or something, all time. But this is an allegory. Like the main character's name is Christian. He goes to the bog of despair. You know what I'm saying? So it is like, oh yeah, it's a bog. He gets like trapped in it, but it's like, it's allegorical. It all represents something. In kind of a simple way almost. You know what I mean? Like things are almost like one-to-one. And this is how Augustine read the Bible, and we're maybe familiar with this way of reading the Bible from Paul himself, because I know just the first thing that comes to my head is like, what? Oh no, I was thinking of like his reading of the Old Testament, like Hagar,
Sarah.
Yeah, like Hagar and Sarah. Do you know what I mean? Like they're people, but they're representing certain things for us today to learn from. Does that make sense? Okay, so this allegorical way of reading the Old Testament is in the New Testament itself, interestingly. But this is how people read the Bible from Augustine to the Reformation. But what Augustine says is we can read the book of nature the same way. So this is from Augustine. Some people, in order to discover God, read a book, but there is a great book, the very appearance of created things. Look above and below, note, read. God, whom you want to discover, did not make the letters with ink. He put in front of your eyes the very things that he made. Can you ask for a louder voice than that? So here you sort of see the idea of the book of nature, you know what I mean, from Augustine himself, saying, yeah, you can read it in the Bible, but look around, like there's a lot to see from God to us if we just look at this. And then this is what's really interesting too, though, is they read the book of nature allegorically. And I have an example of this. This Aberdeen Bestiary, which is online. At the end of the class, if you want, I can send you the links. I have everything in slides together. But it's online. It's from around 1200. You know what a bestiary is? Like a book that describes animals. Yeah. It's a perfect example of how Christians read nature allegorically. So the University of Aberdeen has it all digitized. It has, beautiful illustrations. It's in Latin, but it has the Latin transcribed. It has an English translation, and it has some helpful information like this. So we made a big jump in time here, right? To 1200, circa 1200. But there's a lot of continuity in the things that I'm talking about today. There's a lot of continuity. And this is probably why, because these are the sort of sources of the Aberdeen bestiary. When you look at like other bestiaries and then like look at the content of the bestiary, and you can look, scholars like combed all these different places and put it together in this kind of like nice little chart. So a lot of the information comes from like ancient Indian, Jewish, and Egyptian legends. These are like some of the earliest human civilizations, right? But then you have a lot of the information comes from the classical world. Aristotle, Herodotus, Pliny the Elder, classical texts about the natural world, and these are still authoritative at this time. Really, they remain authoritative until Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution type. That's when people start challenging the validity of the information and the authority that they have in society, right? And then, of course, it's also mixed in with Christian ideas since then, from the New Testament, from Origen, different places, and then, and then a mix of kind of medieval sources throughout the year. So that's where the content in this book comes from. And I want to give us an example. Here's the goat. So here's the picture of the goat. It's pretty. This is an expensive book, obviously. You know what I mean. This is like pre-print. Print start. Gutenberg, 1450. So this is like a big volume, like a scribe wrote it out very nicely. You can see the writing is also very beautiful. So let's look at the entry on the goat, though. And this has so many different animals. Like this thing's big. So this is just kind of almost like a random one. It says, of the goat, there is an animal called in Latin caper goat because it chooses, capare, to live in rugged places. Some call it capra from crepida, a rustling noise. These are the tame goats, which the Greeks call dorcas, gazelle, because they have very sharp sight. So again, you can sort of see from that section, you can see this sort of evidence of all these different sources that they're drawing from. Does that make sense? So like, okay, I read about this here, I read about that there. Kind of like putting all of that together. Here's information about the goat. They live in high mountains and can tell if men approaching a long way off are hunters or travelers. And here you see the Christian part and the allegorical part. In the same way, our Lord Jesus Christ loves high mountains. That is, the prophets and apostles. So not just that he like preached the Sermon on the Mount on a mountain. Those high mountains are actually the prophets and the apostles. So you see the sort of you see the allegory here, the allegorical reading here already? It says in the Song of Songs, "Behold, my beloved cometh, leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills." See Song of Solomon 2:8. As a goat grazes in the valleys, our Lord grazes on the church. The good works of Christian people are the food of him who said, "For I was hungered, and he gave me meat, I was thirsty, and he gave me drink." Matthew 25. By the valleys of the mountains are understood the churches spread throughout different regions, as it says in the Song of Songs, "My beloved is like a roe or a young hart." The fact that the goat has very sharp eyesight, sees everything and recognizes things from a long way off, signifies our Lord, who is the Lord of all knowing and God. So there's lots of different animals. They all they all have different behaviors, and they all signify different things. But I want you to try to like put yourself in this headspace for a second and just think about the immediacy that Christians felt to God through nature and with nature, if this is how you actually viewed the physical world and the spiritual world. Okay, like God made the goats this way, like he revealed the text of the Bible to teach you these lessons. You see how immediate that is? And when you look at the goat, you can learn some actually pretty specific things here. Do you know what I mean? This is a lot different. That's what I'm saying. This is a lot different than like creationism today, right? Like creationists have this sense like, oh, we need to like hold God like close. That's why I have to hold this. But like no creationist is as close to God through nature as this. That's what I would say. Do you know what I mean? Like nobody today looks at a goat and sees God in this way. You know what I'm saying? And they have I'm telling you, it's like every animal in here, right? So it's really a different way of thinking about nature, and it's kind of made possible through that allegorical reading, or at least that's a kind of vital component of it. So again, it's something that's kind of lost. So like none of you like heard about the concept of the book of nature, but also none of you have probably had the experience of interacting with nature in this way, even though lots of our Christian forebears, I would say, probably did. You know what I mean? Yes?
I would say that this isn't unique just to a Christian viewpoint. I think of indigenous peoples like the American Indians or the Eskimos or things like that, and the way they view nature allegorically, and the way that they saw nature as part of the Great Spirit. And because I read a story about one time they were on a bear hunt. And when they actually killed the bear, they sacrificed to the spirit of the bear. They gave thanks to the spirit of the bear that he's giving them nourishment and that. And so
that's a good point. No, it's a good
human.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I would say I'm not an expert on like non-European cultures from around the world, so I can't speak, or as indigenous people from North America. So I would say that your specific example may or may not. I mean, on some levels, yeah, like maybe similar in the sense that like there's kind of a closeness to nature that maybe modern scientific thought has kind of severed for humanity. like that sounds plausible to me. I would say once you get to the specific beliefs, it could actually be quite different. Do you know what I mean? Like how people thought about a bear and the spirit of the bear from Christian thought in the Middle Ages. And I would suspect that it probably is actually quite a bit different, even though maybe it has this in common compared to our kind of like scientific detached view.
Nature.
Yeah, again, even there, I would say like, yeah, maybe they're learning more from nature, feel like closer proximity to nature than we do now in kind of like modern Western society. I don't know. It'd be interesting. That's like a good research question. See, that would be like a good topic. Who my students go look at that. Like, is there or is there not a similarity between how Christians before the Reformation looked at nature in this Book of Nature lens? Is that similar to indigenous ways of looking at nature? I would say it may or may not be, but it's a really good food for thought. Thanks, Tom. Okay, but in terms of the trajectory of where we're going, this is a very important foundation, because one thing that's for certain is it's different than how we think of nature today. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in each class, is what's the next step where people went from here, and why did our thought develop in the way that it did. And we're going to be looking at the role that the Reformation played there. But next, let's just fill in, again, at a very broad level, the sort of scholastic thought. So in sort of the late Middle Ages, so here we have Ibn Rushd or Averroes, an Islamic philosopher who, again, because like I sort of alluded to already, I think this Aristotelian cosmology in a kind of basic level had a lot of continuity, but some of you may know that like Aristotle's texts and things like that sort of, got lost to Western Europe and were reintroduced through the Islamic world, okay? And this, by the time we get to like the 1100s, this is after this sort of been reintroduced. And I won't fill in the details there that much, but by this time period, people had a lot more of like Aristotle's texts, right? Actually, a lot of them by this point. And Averroes, the sort of Latin name, was called the commentator because he went through Aristotle's text and wrote commentaries on them that were very, Maimonides was a Jewish polymath, physician, philosopher, theologian, everything. And then, of course, we know Thomas Aquinas. These are some of the most influential names, right? And it's really interesting, and this is something I want to point out too, the Abrahamic religions, because Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all trace their heritage back to Abraham, Father Abraham, right? Like you learned when you were a kid. Father Abraham had many sons, and not just Christians, right? So this is also a different culture that existed at this time period, because this is kind of what I discovered on my own path to this from my research when I was looking at printed books in Reformation Germany, like in Lutheran Germany, about the weather, because that's what I study. You see you see the names of lots of Islamic philosophers popping up in here, in these texts, because they're authorities on the natural world. You know what I mean? So later we have this kind of like East-West divide and this sort of like Western idea of like Western superiority, where it's sort of like, oh, like what could we learn from the Muslim world, right? But that's not at all the case in this time period. So that's kind of an important thing to understand. Another interesting, Maimonides wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed, in which he tackles sort of head-on the seeming contradictions that you have, like in scriptures, like in our Old Testament, I think what we call the Old Testament in Christianity, right? So these ideas that are happening now between like the internal cohesion of the Bible, of the relationship between the Bible and what we observe in nature, religious people have been grappling with these things throughout the history of these religions. But in this time period, and then of course kind of culminating with Thomas Aquinas in Christian thought, what we call scholastic thought, you have this harmonization between our understanding of nature based off of Aristotelian views and Christianity, and not just Christianity, but also the other two Abrahamic religions. Does that make sense to everybody? So you mentioned the eternity of the earth. I like to say this is the first creation debate. It wasn't like young earth or old earth. It was like eternal earth or not. Because Aristotle said it was eternal, and Aristotle is the authority on nature. So, but Christians, it says like creation out of nothing, right? So that's kind of the tension there. And it's true, Thomas Aquinas said God created it just because the Bible says it, not because philosophically there's good reason to believe it. Does that make sense? Like based off of reason or evidence or whatever. But this is another thing that I saw in my sources. Martin Luther, we'll get to this next week. Martin Luther was very critical of scholasticism. Maybe you know that or not. And he would say a lot of times he would levy this attack against Aquinas and the scholastics that they say the earth is eternal. And I thought it was kind of like a straw man argument, but what I've learned, and this is what you can see if you look at this book that I brought here today, is that actually in Christian thought, there was a range of views on the issue, even whether the earth is eternal or not. And it wasn't like a dogmatic thing that you had to believe or not believe one way or the other in medieval Christianity. So it's really not such a straw man for Luther to kind of be saying people believe the earth is eternal. Actually, there's an interesting argument, and I forget if it comes from Averroes himself or another scholar, that the earth has to be eternal. The physical universe has to be eternal, but it's not disrupting the hierarchy between creator and created that we have, and actually that creator-created relationship is kind of the foundation for the argument, because it says God is also unchanging, right? So if God's unchanging, how could he have not created and then at some point he does create? Do you see what I'm saying there? That kind of like messes with the immutability of God. So it says, why not just say God created something that's eternal and he's also eternal. So you see what I'm saying? Like this is how these debates go. A lot of times it's sort of like, sure, he could have created something eternal. Like why couldn't God do that? So that's the kind of like logic behind things right here. But it was a real open. Even that issue was a real like open discussion. But this kind of brings us up to where we wanted to get to today, kind of chronologically, the end of this kind of like pre-Reformation moment, and then we're going to see how the story kind of changes next week. But this is our kind of starting point, our foundation, and sort of show like that narrative is talking about like everybody just believed what some people still believe today. Like no, like just not possibly true, because like none of you knew anything that I taught today until just now. Do you know what I mean? So like, and nobody knows this stuff anymore. So it's not. So what you know now is not what people used to believe. So that's why it's kind of a fun starting point. Okay, that's where we'll leave it for today. But thank you guys so much, and I'm looking forward to picking the story up next week.
Thanks, guys.